Hi everyone, today I'd like to quickly show you how you can use Databar to connect custom APIs. So custom APIs are very handy if there's an integration that we don't currently have installed on Databar and you want to connect it, if you have internal connectors that you want to add to your Databar tables, or if there's a custom API that you want to send data to. Currently, we support two types of custom APIs. You can add an API to run as an enrichment, which pulls data into your table, or you can use custom connectors for exporters, which will send data into a custom system from your Databar table. So here is an example of a table that I've created, and I'd like to add a custom API to the spreadsheet. So I'll click on Enrich and click on Add or Use Your Own REST API. And here I can already see one API that's been pre-connected, but let me add a new one. So I'll click Add a New Connector. And let's give it a name, so I'll call it Test API. We'll use it as an enrichment, and it will be a GET request. So here I have an example API from bScepter, so I'll just copy over the API link and paste it in here. And let's also add the endpoint for this API, which is /todos. This will get a list of to-do items. We can add parameters. So parameters are essentially the equivalent of, let's say you had an API with parameters that have something like param1 equals, test input. That's where you can add parameters, which will then be added dynamically from your table. And I'll show you guys how to do that in a second. So I'll save this API. And now I can see it in my list of custom added connectors. So I'll click on Test API now. And since we didn't add any parameters, there's no mapping. And everything else works just like regular enrichments. So I can just click on Add One Column. And now that this API is in here, I can just run requests. So let me just run this first row. And there we go. Here's the data that we've received from the API. If we go back into bScepter to double check the sample request, we can see here that a request was made to the to-dos endpoint. Now let's try to add some custom parameters. Let me go back to the integrations page to edit it. I'll click on Test API, and I'll add a parameter, which will be, we'll just call it param1. And we can also add a default value. So for example, if you have an API that requires an API key or requires some sort of value that's passed in every time you make a request, you can input a default value, which will always be in there. And then you'll also be able to override this default value from the table if you need to. So let's say there's an API that has an API key type authorization. So you can just add the key for the API key and input your API key here. For now, let's skip over the API key, and I'll just add param1, and I'll set a default value in here, default value 1. The same thing goes for headers and for the body. Now, headers and body is mostly used for, body is mostly used for post requests. So when you're sending data, you'd most likely be sending it as part of the API's body. So you'll be using these parameters. You just need to check on the API's documentation to see exactly how everything works. So let me save this one now and go back to my table. Now if I open this API and click Edit, I'll see that there's a new parameter in here, and it's already pre-filled as the default value. So if I just save this now, it's going to always send default value 1 with the request. But I actually want to map it up to this column called parameters to pass along. So I'll just map it up to this column and click Save. And now every time I run a request, it's going to pass these parameters along with the API request. So here we can see, if we go back into bScepter, we can see to-dos param1 equals test value 1, test value 2, and test value 3, showing that these parameters are actually being passed along. That's how you add enrichments. So the way you add custom exporters is exactly the same. It will just require a different, form of parameters and a different type of connector. So I'll click add a new connector from the share sidebar and call it exporter test. It's already pre-filled as an exporter, and it's already pre-filled as a post type request because most data senders or exporters use post requests. Again, you'll need to check the documentation of the API to be sure. Here we have a post request for to-dos, so I'll just use the same endpoint. And let's pass a value in the body. So body test 1. Now I'll click save. And when I click on this API, I can simply add it, click add exporter. And now every time I run this request, data will be sent along with this exporter. There we go. We have a post request to to-dos. If you have any other questions, please reach out to us via our community Discord or via email. Thank you for watching this video.